I was never in school, in public school, with anybody but white folk. And when I went away to college, my worldview began to expand a little bit.
The cause of unity in Longview has many champions. One of these is Reverend Bob Bruce. Born in Radford, Virginia, Reverend Bruce became the minister at St. Andrew Presbyterian in Longview in 1981. He has since retired.
I don't know that I really ever understood myself so much as a community activist as there were some things that were just the right thing to do.
I think for Bob, one of the things that is always part of his liturgy is the Matthew 22 passage where love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself.
Bob Bruce, first and foremost, is a man of faith, and his faith was deeply rooted in the summary of the law. You shall love your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he took that second law to, well, obviously the first law was important, but they took that second law to heart. And he saw that on Sundays that day was the most segregated day in the city, and he wanted to do something about it.
The same Bob you see on Fridays is the same one you see on Sundays. He's real. He's whatever you see is what you get from him. When you see him, he's not putting on a show. He's just a real individual, and he's not hypocritical, and that's what I really like about Bob.
I was not familiar with Lift Every Voice and Sing, James Weldon Johnson's poem and great hymn. And one of the interesting things, for me at least, is that when we sang that here in the church before we ever had the MLK service. And Vera Thomas, who was one of our faithful members, came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, Bob, when I was in school growing up, and I think perhaps she went to school in Jefferson, I'm not certain of it, I know she taught in Jefferson. She said that every morning we started school with prayer, the national anthem, and the black national anthem, which was Lift Every Voice and Sing. So, I get kind of emotional about that, but because I think of Vera. Great person.
Bob, Reverend Bruce, came to this church, my church, and his former church, St. Andrew, in 1981. And that's when I met him, and that's when I knew he was going to be trouble. He wasn't just going to be preaching and ministering and pastoring our congregation. He wanted to see us reaching out more in the community.
Sissy Ward and Algie Thomas, who was a member of this church, and I sat down and talked about what we would do, and Algie suggested that we get together with Darnell Thomas and go from there.
Really, the church is kind of behind instead of being in front when it comes to race relations. We should have been out front. The Sunday morning worship should have reflected a united front for all Christians across racial lines, even across denominational lines. So I thought that was a great step towards Christian unity.
We didn't have any grand plan when we started. It actually became a bigger thing than we thought it would. It speaks well for the community, really.
To approach me about giving homage and patronage to one of the greatest persons to walk this earth since Jesus and Moses and Martin Luther King. That said something to me, not only about him, but about his congregation and the members who supported him in that process.
In 2014, Reverend Bruce was not the only name to come to the top of the Unity selection process. The man who exercised tremendous courage to give the idea of racial unity a chance was Reverend Darnell Thomas. Born in Pittsburgh, Texas, and later the pastor of McCabe United Methodist, Reverend Thomas has since retired from the ministry.
The dean sent for me and said, sign this particular statement and I'll force them to change your grade. And I was sometimes a little bit unreasonable too. I said, if he can live with it on his conscience, knowing that they haven't given me the test, I can live with it on a piece of paper called a transcript, because I know I'm not a C student. I left it at that, But they changed my grades later on. I made 2 A's and 2 B's, though 4 C's. So a lot of things you don't have to take if you persevere. And you don't have to compromise principles, ethics, and convictions. People learn to respect you.
And I remember one particular incident, and this kind of addresses Reverend Thomas's history as a civil rights activist, because that's what I know him as. And in talking to people that knew him way back when, he was instrumental in East Texas, not just Longview, in the civil rights movement. And when he at one point had called legal services and requested that we have a presence in Pittsburgh, because there was a disciplinary action that had been taken at the high school. When we left, we had to go get gas. And this truck pulled up to the gas station and parked next to us. And this gentleman got out of his truck and pointed his fingers at us, just like I'm pointing my finger at you, and he went, Now, I went home to Longview. Darnell Thomas had to live there.
Well, I think with Darnell, you kind of get what you see, and he's obviously pretty passionate about the whole business of civil rights.
I was always a rebel and a nonconformist to any maltreatment against me from anybody. My daddy used to predict I wouldn't live to get 21 years old. So, but I got to tell him before he passed in '94, I'm certainly glad your prophecy didn't come true. Longview has always been a place where we have had some reasonable people. They have had some good county officials, county commissioners court. They've had their problems, but it was a lot different from a lot of other cities. I went to school in Tyler. Longview was much more liberal then.
In 1984, certainly by that time the schools were fully integrated and people were becoming accustomed to living together and sharing things that hadn't happened in the late 60s and 70s. So while there was marked improvement, I think there still wasn't a whole lot of integration outside the public schools.
But let me be clear. If it hadn't been for people like Bob Bruce, Steve Crane, and a few more, we would have still been fighting slavery.
There were places, like in Marshall, Texas, there was the KK Club, and club was spelled with a K. Race relations, I think, were something that wasn't really discussed. It was just the way things were at the time. I remember Clarence Bailey telling me at one point that I was one of the only people that would say hello to him out in public. And this was somebody, a very successful, well-educated businessman in the community. So I think at that point in time, race relations were not really being addressed.
It was a lot of efforts being made, but there was still a lot of tension, a lot of racism, and I think that was the reason for organizing the race relations group, is to try to bring about a better understanding between the races.
And to Reverend Thomas, I would like to just say thank you for what you've done throughout your life to make this a better place. And I still would like to be more like you.
It's a great honor.
You know, to be honest, I'm glad to receive it. You know, my mother and daddy certainly emphasized that humility was one of the things you had to practice in life. In this case, I humbly am glad to receive it. It means a lot to me. I've felt strongly about it all my life, about civil rights, and so it means a lot to me. It also, I think, it would be wrong if I didn't say I kind of receive it on behalf of St. Andrew Church.
Race relations, things are much better than they were. But we still have a long ways to go, and I think Ferguson, Missouri, and New York City, Los Angeles proved that. But where there is no communication about problems, you have outbursts. Both white and black don't want to talk about race.
Unity is important to God, I guess, to start with, and therefore important to God's people. And the separation we experience is a sinful thing. It's not what was intended by creation and not what is intended for the human family.
Well, I think Bob and Darnell were real pioneers and were not afraid to start something new and to cross the barrier of race and do that together.